You sort of blink and one day realise that it's just covered in little tiny bobbles. Welcome to another episode of Your Knitting Problems Solved, the Knitting Agony Aunt series from me, Anushka of the Crimson Stitchery. I've been knitting for nearly 20 years now, and in this series I will be answering the most burning questions that viewers have submitted. This video will go on a playlist called Your Knitting Problems Solved, as well as on the yarn playlist. Show notes and links are in the description box below as always, and just before we get started, this video is sponsored by my lovely and wonderful channel supporters. If you enjoy my videos, please do consider joining us on Patreon or making a one-off contribution on PayPal. Check out the links below to find out how. So our question today comes from Micah. Micah asks, bit of a philosophical question, bit grounded in material reality and slow fashion, and making things that will last. Is it worth knitting a garment from a yarn you know will pill significantly? Where significantly means whatever amount is enough to be personally noticeable. Thanks for your question, Micah, and I'm a bit curious if you're a scientist or not, so thank you for defining our variable here, which is significantly. Let's unravel this. Okay, so this is just something that all knitters, all wearers of clothes will deal with at some point, which is that some yarns pill. We've surely all been there, whether that is for a beloved hand knit where you sort of blink and one day realise that it's just covered in little tiny bobbles, or maybe it's for a store-bought garment, and that might be a sweater, but it could also be a pair of trousers, a suit, a jacket, a skirt, you know, something that's been machine knitted. It could be something made out of wool, it might be a blend of synthetic fibres. Pilling can be really irritating because it can totally ruin the look of a garment that is otherwise, you know, not only completely functional, but also can be quite beloved. And the reason that this happens is that basically loose fibres work their way up to the surface of the fabric. They then mat together, they clump up and fuse, and they fuse into little bubbles, into little pills or lumps, or sometimes long sort of sausage-like configurations. It can vary how noticeable they are. It just depends on the individual fabric and fibre in question. Sometimes these loose fibres actually shed off and you might leave an imprint of yourself on the surface that you've been sitting or leaning against. But sometimes they just gather up and they form almost like a second skin, right? Like this additional layer over the top of your garment that can be pretty unsightly. Now, this is something that is to do with the spin of the yarn or the thread used, the weave of the fabric, to do with the fibre content. It doesn't necessarily relate to whether or not you spend a ton of money, because expensive yarns, expensive garments, they can pill as well, right? So I think that there's this idea that if you just buy a higher quality garment or a higher quality yarn, I'm kind of talking about these things interchangeably here because of the way that the question was framed about slow fashion. So we're talking about clothes essentially. There is this idea that if you just buy really good quality things, they should last forever. But that's not necessarily the case, because if it is a really delicate fibre, or if the construction of the fabric is in some kind of diaphanous, ethereal way, it's going to look worn, basically. So sometimes when it's not necessarily to do with the money, although it can be due to the quality. You know, maybe it's more likely to happen with cheap garments. And that might be because cheaper garments might be made using yarns that are very loosely plied together and kind of puffed up with air. You might have noticed this, you know, if you take a piece of fast fashion and it might be a dress, but you find that you can fold it up very, very small and the fabric kind of compresses down to nothing. Or it's extremely lightweight. If it's, you know, been made from a very loosely woven fabric, it probably will disintegrate more quickly. And things that are more kind of densely put together, a bit more firm, may well end up being, you know, having more longevity. Think of it in terms of the way that bed sheets are sold, in terms of the, you know, the thread count basically. Cheaper items tend to be made using a lower thread count. So there's less fibre physically present there. It's lighter, the fibres are woven more loosely together, there's more air present. If there's more air present, there's more space for loose fibres to then work up to the surface and pill, clump together and pill. The reason why I highlight this thing about cost, even when it comes to yarn, is because it's not necessarily related to cost, it's to do with construction method. So actually on the jumper that I'm wearing today, and this is a design that I did a few years ago, and I've been kind of on and off been working it into a pattern, but I keep hitting these roadblocks, so maybe it will be released this year. It's called the Pink Blob Sweater. I've tried to rename it, but nothing's ever stuck. And this is made using knit collage yarn, which is, you know, it's pretty pricey. The knit collage very, very generously sent me the yarn for this design, so thank you. But it's, you know, it's pretty pricey yarn, and it's a hand spun yarn. So I was pretty dismayed when I saw that the fabric was actually forming into some pills, even though I've not worn this jumper a ton yet. So the reason for that is because it's a hand spun yarn that is just made of 2 plies of fibre. Basically there's a ply of metallic thread and there's some very loose, puffy, delightful, spongy wool fibre. So this is an example of a yarn that's like an artisanal yarn. It's a luxury product, but the way that the yarn's been designed, which is to be very airy, very soft, very light, means that it's light. The construction of the yarn means that there's loose fibre available, which can shed off, and it can melt together and clump together a little bit and form pills. Even though it is a good quality, I would say, and very lovely product, this yarn. Let's unpick the knots. So I was really struck by the way that Micah wrote this question. She frames it as a bit of a philosophical question. The words and phrases that really stood out to me here are: is it worth it? Material reality, slow fashion, and making things that last. So I think that Micah's question is not necessarily around how to deal with pills yarns that pill in a physical way, in a technical way, but thinking about it more holistically. Obviously, the phrase slow fashion jumps out because it's in contrast to the idea of fast fashion, right? High street, ready to wear, cheap garments that are kind of you have a throwaway mentality, or they're only made to reflect one fashion trend cycle, and they'll just be discarded and end up on a pile, a mountain of discarded clothes somewhere in the global south, which will be polluting their environment and choking up their local economies. So not really a glorious destination to imagine, certainly for your hand knitted garments that you've made yourself. But also there's this idea of making things that last, right? In contrast to fast fashion, slow fashion, you know, it lasts for a longer time, isn't necessarily so transient. She says, grounded in material reality. And I am going to interpret this as kind of being quite pragmatic and being realistic about what's going to happen to certain fibres, not just sort of at end of life, like I've just been alluding to, but also just, you know, in the process of wearing it, just accepting that some yarns pill, and maybe you've discovered that because you've been working, you've made a garment using a yarn, you loved the yarn, you'd love to use it again, but you've just noticed that the garment hasn't held up at all, and it frankly looks awful. And is it worth it? So this to me seems to relate to the idea of time and effort, because I think that's the idea of worth that I'm getting here. Is it worth spending the time? Is it worth bothering if it's just going to end up looking rubbish? So I think these are all really, really valid concerns, and they center around making really careful decisions about the projects that you choose, the yarns that you choose, so that we can think really carefully about the life of the object, of the knitted object, right? Not having objects that just kind of aren't going to hold up, right? Maybe not spending our time doing making those projects, not spending our money on buying those yarns. So obviously these ideas are quite personal to you. So if you have a yarn that you know is going to pill, but you love working with it, maybe it just felt absolutely amazing, it feels nice on your body, you love the colors, maybe it's from a really wonderful producer that you have a relationship with and you want to support their business if possible, but it's just something about the finished project has been dissatisfying because it hasn't held up to wear. These are my 5 tips for dealing with yarns that you know are going to pill. Tip number 1 is to try knitting that yarn at a tighter tension. Now, this isn't necessarily going to work 100%, but I would say if it's a yarn that you absolutely loved and you really would like to work with it again, or maybe you've got lots of it, have a go at knitting something with a tighter tension and see how it holds up. I have seen advice out there when it comes to these kind of pilly, sheddy yarns. You know, things like, oh, make a swatch and carry it around in your pocket and feel it every day and see if it pills, like to sort of do a little test. But maybe you'd get some information from that. But in my opinion, I mean, for my lifestyle, that wouldn't really be practical and I would just forget to do it. And I'd end up putting the yarn in the washing machine and then it would just be, the size of a postage stamp. Again, I like this phrase, grounded in material reality, like being pragmatic. What are you actually going to do? You could subject it to a battery of tests, but I probably wouldn't bother with that, but I might experiment with knitting at a slightly tighter tension to see if that helps things slightly. It's probably still going to pill, but it might possibly pill a little bit more slowly. Now, I can't make any promises. It might not make any difference, but that would be my first port of call. Tip number 2 is to choose a project that avoids abrasion. So the areas that you are going to see pilling most often on a sweater tend to be underarms and sleeves, right? And that's because it's where your arms are moving around your body and the 2 fabric surfaces are touching each other, or your arms are going in and out with maybe jackets, sleeves and things like that. Anywhere the fabric is rubbing together, whether that's on itself or on your body or whatever it is, you're going to notice that you're going to see more pills, right? Because the pills are caused by the loose fibres clumping together. And so if there's all of this movement and abrasion, there is space, physical space for those fibres to get moving, to find each other and to lock on. So in order to try and mitigate this, I would choose projects where, either it's not a very tight fit or it's just worn in a different part of the body, right? So maybe you don't make it into a very close-fitting, neat little sweater, but maybe it's a much looser cardigan, for example, or maybe you don't make it into a sweater at all, but it works quite well for a hat because, once it's on your head, it's on, unless you're going to kind of go and like start rubbing your head up against things and stuff like that. But, you get the gist. Or maybe you wear it as a shawl or something like that, right? So that there's less friction going on the yarn. So you might find some success there, which allows you to still use that yarn, but use it for very specific projects only. Tip number 3 is to go ahead and make up your lovely yarn, your pilly yarn in your chosen project, whatever that is. So maybe, you ignore the last advice, you do make it up into whatever you love, but you keep that garment for special occasions only. You just limit the time in which you wear it. So I think that this can relate quite nicely to the slow fashion idea, because if you wear a garment quite seldom, providing that after that you air it out, you store it correctly, in theory, that garment should last you for much longer, right? Because it's not being physically worn out. It's not being worn outside, suffering from the elements, from the weather, from your own body, right? Your perspiration, being caught on things and, just being subjected to general wear and tear and whatever life throws at you. But if you just keep it for special occasions, you're reducing all of that. You're reducing like the tension, the abrasion, the friction. And in theory, you should be able to keep the garment for that little bit longer and avoid pills for that little bit longer. And if you have fewer pills, you know, maybe it's easy to just remove them by, you know, carefully snipping them off very, very carefully so that you don't damage the fabric beneath. And maybe that's all a little bit more manageable. Now, I do get that sometimes, you know, sometimes the fabric is just so pilly that literally you wear it and you're just covered in pills, even after 1 or 2 wears. And I have had this experience, you know, with one cardigan in particular. I'm not going to name and shame the yarn producer, so I'm just not going to talk about like any details, but I spent a long time knitting a really complicated cable pattern all over a cardigan, only to find that the yarn just pilled immediately and it just looked like horrendous. So on that occasion, I would suggest just accepting it and using that yarn for more informal items, maybe for home use, maybe for layering so that you're wearing it underneath, you know, maybe something that's a bit smarter on top, something that you don't mind so much if it doesn't look, you know, totally sharp. Like it's not something that you're going to be giving a TED talk in, maybe. It's just something that you can, you know, wear to just go about your day-to-day life, where you know, you're not under scrutiny, like your appearance isn't under scrutiny. I think that it can live out probably a very long life, probably quite a successful life, under that category of sort of informal garments, maybe homeware. And honestly, if you think about kind of use per wear, like we do have those special occasion garments, like I was just talking about, they're often, you know, quite expensive. Maybe we just wear them a few times, even though they were kind of quite a big ticket item, like a big purchase. But actually those kind of, so oftentimes cheaper items, more nondescript items, you know, can be the things that we wear all the time and that kind of accompany us in our life a lot more, even if they don't necessarily look that great. Maybe they feel great and there's other things about them that are really, really appealing that mean that we keep reaching for that garment. And I think that that's also not only valid, but quite a lovely thing to have. So, you know, it's also about how we feel, not only on how terrible the pills look on the garment's surface. Just before I give my last tip, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who supports this channel, whether through a one-off donation or a monthly subscription over on Patreon. Your contributions help to fund this channel so that I can continue making free and helpful videos that are available to all. If you enjoy my videos, you can support the Crimson Stitchery through Patreon or PayPal. Find the links in the description box below, and thank you again. Tip number 5 is the ultimate pragmatist's tip. Tip number 5 is the ultimate in pragmatism. Just admire that yarn from afar. You know what? Sometimes you just need to say no and say, that yarn is going to pill. And actually, it's not worth my time. I've got enough slobbing around the home sweatshirts. I've got plenty of beautiful garments that I can wear out of the house. I can wear to work, I can wear to parties, I can wear when I feel great, and I'm happy with those. And I don't want to be worried or even concerned about having a garment which pills, because it's not worth it. And it's not worth taking time to pick off all of those pills carefully when frankly, there is so much yarn out in the world, like so much. There's so much yarn out there, like we are never going to run out of yarn. Or clothes, but I know that knitters are just really worried about running out of yarn, right? So we've got to buy all of the yarn because it's going to disappear. Don't worry, it's not true. Don't buy into the fallacy. Like there is always going to be more yarn out there and there's always going to be another sale, right? Just leave that pilly yarn on the shelf and walk away and tell yourself it's just yarn. And also your desire for that yarn is just a desire and it's just a fleeting thought that will pass. And probably you've got some really nice jumpers and stuff at home that you've already made. Just saying. And if I'm going to be honest with you, my personal opinion, you know, my personal approach to this issue is I wouldn't bother, because to me it's not worth it. And the kind of, you know, the approaches that I listed in the first 4 tips are more ways of making the best of the situation. You know, maybe you've already bought the yarn and you made one project and you've got leftovers and you don't know what to do with it. Or you've already made the garment and you're not, you know, you're trying to deal with it because you don't want to get rid of it. But overall, my opinion is that it's not worth it, and it's better to find a yarn that's not going to pill. So thank you very much for writing in with your question, Micah. And if you have a knitty problem that you would like me to help you unravel, please do submit your question in the form, which is linked down below. And just before you go off, I would actually really like to hear from you. Do drop me a comment down below and let me know what your approach is to this issue. I know that there's going to be lots of opinions here because there's lots of different situations in which this applies, and I'm really, really intrigued to know what you do with this issue, what you do with pilly yarns, and what solutions that you have come up with and why. So drop me a comment down below and let me know. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the like button down below. It really helps me get the word out about the Crimson Stitchery. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Happy knitting and see you next time. Bye.